Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about termination policies for our auto-scaling groups. So in our DevOps doctrine, let's go into auto-scaling concepts and let's click on termination policies. So we've configured an auto-scaling group, and right now it doesn't have any instances, but it will shortly. And what do auto-scaling groups do? They scale out and then they scale in. So we're talking about our old standards of high availability and elasticity. So at some point, we're going to need to terminate instances from our auto-scaling group, and that's where termination policies come into play. So termination policies are used to determine which instances should be terminated when there is a scale-in event. So an understanding of termination policies and which instances are terminated when your auto-scaling group scales in is certainly a big part of what we're trying to accomplish when we're deploying or updating our environment. So our termination policy really answers one simple question: which instance should be terminated and why? So let's discuss termination policies a bit and we'll find out. All right, so first let's understand where we get at these termination policies. And the policies are configured in the auto-scaling group configuration settings. So let's go into EC2 and let's go back into the auto-scaling group that we created. And we look at the Details tab, and if we scroll down a little bit, we see our desired, our min, our max size. And right now it's just 0. We're not doing anything. This will change shortly. Health check type. We could have an EC2 or an ELB health check grace period. 300 seconds, otherwise known as 5 minutes. Our default cooldown, 5 minutes. We could have a placement group. Suspended processes, which we will talk about in the next lesson. And here we go. Default termination policy. And here's our termination policy. And right now we have the default, which we will be looking at shortly. So let's click on Edit. And you see, we can edit the termination policy. Let's add an extra termination policy. So as you can see, we can have multiple termination policies. And they will be executed in order left to right. We can add every single one of these if we choose to. So, if our first policy does not find a suitable instance to terminate, the next policy in line gets evaluated, and so on, until a suitable instance is found to terminate. Now, typically, what we would want to do is have the default policy actually last. So let's remove that. And then we can re-add it. So basically, it's kind of the catch-all. And this being a DevOps course, I'm going to make the analogy that this default policy is kind of like in error handling. You kind of have your catch-all at the end. And that's basically the function of this default policy. So let's bounce over to our diagram and look at each of these policies in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the oldest instance policy. It will terminate the oldest instance in the auto-scaling group. And this policy is useful when you're upgrading the instances in your auto-scaling group to a new instance type. So think about that. If you're going to a completely new instance type, certainly the oldest one is going to be that old instance type. Of course, until you completely terminate all of the older instances. Then we have the newest instance policy. Terminate the newest instance in the group. And this policy is useful when you're testing a new launch configuration, but don't want to keep it in production. So that makes a heck of a lot of sense to use the new instance policy for that situation. Next, we have the oldest launch configuration. Terminate instances that have the oldest launch configuration. And this policy is useful when you're updating a group and phasing out the instances from a previous configuration. In other words, you're going to another launch configuration and you want to phase out the instances that came from the original launch configuration. Next policy, closest to next instance hour. Terminate instances that are closest to the next billing hour. This policy helps you maximize the use of your instances and manage your Amazon EC2 usage costs. So basically, when you terminate the instance that's closest to the next billing hour, think of squeezing the juice out of a lemon. You've got as much of the juice out of that lemon, and that's a bad analogy. Hopefully the instance didn't perform like a lemon, but you got as much of it out of it as possible, and then you terminate it. And the default, terminate instances according to the default termination policy. And the policy is useful when you have more than one scaling policy for the group. So again, this is kind of the catch-all, and we're going to take a look at the default one in depth in just a few minutes. Here's an important point. Even if we have custom termination policies, the auto-scaling will first check for imbalances across availability zones. Let's say you have 4 instances in an AZ and maybe another AZ with 2 instances. The auto-scaling will apply your custom policy to the AZ that has 4 instances. So again, we can have as many policies applied as we want. And let's just get rid of a couple. So let's say we saved at this point. So our termination policy, it's going to look for oldest instance, newest instance. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, but just in general, again, from first to last, these are going to be evaluated. Finally, the default. Let's take a look at the default termination policy, and this will just give us a good idea of how this is all going to work. So let's click on our default termination policy button, and we have a little flow chart for the default termination policy. So our auto-scaling group needs to scale in. So what's the first question asked? And that is, are there instances in multiple AZs? And let's say the answer is yes. Select the AZ with the most instances, and we flow down to the next block. Likewise, if the answer is no, we go straight down to the next block. Select the instances with the oldest launch configuration. Okay. Now, what if there are multiple instances using the oldest launch configuration? Or better yet, stated as a question for you Jeopardy fans, are there multiple instances using the oldest launch configuration? If the answer is no, we're done. We can just go ahead and terminate that instance with the oldest launch configuration. Now, if the answer is yes, we then select the instances closest to the next billing hour. Same thing. Now we have another question. Are multiple instances closest to the next billing hour? No, we just have one. Okay, terminate it. Yes, let's say we have 2 instances that are closest to the next billing hour. Let's say both of these instances have been up for 54 minutes. Well, then one is just selected at random and it's terminated. Now, as you can see, the default termination policy is pretty thorough, and it might be a case where it suits your needs and you don't even have to use any of these other termination policies. But it's good to know how everything works, and it's certainly good to know that you can add any or all of these policies. Now, we've already created a launch configuration, and we've certainly talked a lot about launch configurations. And we've seen when we want to create an auto-scaling group, we do have to create or specify an existing launch configuration. And it's important to understand that you can only specify one launch configuration for an auto-scaling group at one time. It's also important to note that once created, you can't modify a launch configuration. So in the last lesson, we created a launch configuration sort of just as an exercise. Now, if we need something a little bit different, we're not going to be able to modify that. It's not a huge deal. It only took a minute to create. We can just create a new launch configuration that meets our needs. Let's say we have an auto-scaling group that has launched instances with an existing launch configuration. But now we want a different launch configuration. So we go ahead and create that, and we attach that launch configuration to our auto-scaling group. And remember, we can only have one assigned to our auto-scaling group. So for our termination policy, we would want oldest launch configuration to be in place, and it certainly wouldn't hurt to have the default termination policy as a backup. So in this way, our instances from the old launch configuration can be phased out. All right, so as we wrap up, let's close our default termination policy flowchart, and let's make note of a couple key points. Now note, we can apply instance protection, and let's look at the note. If protect from scaling is set, newly launched instances will be protected from scale-in by default. Auto-scaling will not select protected instances for termination during scale-in. So basically, we have our termination policies set, but no matter what, if instance protection is applied to an instance, our termination policies will not terminate that instance. So in that case, the only way that an instance with instance protection can be terminated is by manually terminating the instance, or if the instance is marked as unhealthy and then removed from the group. And just another important point, this instance protection can be applied to an individual instance, but it can also be applied to an entire auto-scaling group. And of course, if we have it applied to a whole group, our termination policies will be totally ineffective in terminating instances in our group. All right, so again, before completing the lab, let's say we want to modify our termination policies. We're in the auto-scaling group, the Details tab. We click the Edit button, which we have already done, so now it's a Save button. And we can come down here, and we can select any or all of these termination policies. And our default is kind of a catch-all. So for now, let's go with oldest launch configuration and our default, and let's just click Save. And with that, we have completed this lesson on termination policies. So let's mark this lesson complete, and let's move on to the next.